Hi! Do I even bother with the Meme Mom intro? No, I don't.
It's your meme.
Today we're going to talk about 1950s, thus the 1950s inspired look. To be honest, I didn't bother to set my hair yesterday, so like the full-on 50s curly hair look is not here. Let's proceed with nitpicking on what people think about 1950s. I had a lot of requests to do this, and I think the reason is because 1950 is one of the most misinterpreted decades or eras when it comes to fashion history. There's a lot of other eras like that, for example 18th century or 1920s as I've mentioned before, but 1950s for some reason, I think maybe because of the cultural impact that it had on the history of the humankind and fashion, it basically works on our imagination really well and it does not always bring the best results. So first of all, as with every video I've done so far on this similar topic, 1950s was a way more complex era than everyone is thinking in terms of fashion. We usually tend to have this one particular picture of what fashion looked like at the time, but obviously a lot more happened in that era and not everyone were the same, and especially after World War II there were a lot of differences between the countries as well. So for example, French fashion from the era is completely different from, let's say, American fashion or German fashions, whereas in Poland fashion was also completely different because we had a different political system that affected the way people dress. It's important to remember that if you have a particular image that's connected to an era, it's probably 1/100th of what happened in terms of fashion at that time. So this does apply to a couple of major stereotypes that people have reinforced when it comes to 1950s. First of them is the kind of rockabilly rock and roll style that I see a lot when it comes to like 1950s costumes or 1950s parties. Basically everyone just throws on a bandana and a skirt and saddle shoes and they're ready to go. And I mean, it's not that inaccurate. There were some people that wore this style. Obviously it differed a lot from what we see nowadays at costume parties or like costume stores or whatever, but it was like a small group of people. It was basically a subculture at the time. Even people dancing rock and roll on a regular basis, such as teenagers or like students, they would probably have been dressed in a much more modest and conservative style, which consisted of like a buttoned up blouse, flared skirts, and like ballerinas or heels. So like all of those elements are a very particular style that not everyone sported, and that's just it. There's a lot of misconceptions that the rockabilly style has put into people's minds. I don't mean to like be salty. A lot of people just think that modern rockabilly is what people wore at the time, and it's hugely inspired. It takes a lot of inspiration, but it's not at all historically accurate. So like not everyone was like running around with polka dot skirts and a bandana. It's an easy way to imitate some of the silhouettes from the era, but it's by no means an accurate representation of what people wore. So that's one thing that I think is important to remember, is that at that time fashion was primarily for grown-ups. It changed in late 1960s, but up until that era everything that was proposed by the designers or like fashion brands was supposed to be worn by grown-ups. Basically anyone that was not a grown-up at the time, kids, teenagers, people in their early 20s, they would wear similar styles, but they would also have a completely different style that was made especially for younger people. And one of these things that were sort of a symbol of that style was saddle shoes, and also some younger people wore ponytails as well. So all these things that nowadays are kind of symbols of 1950s were actually sort of off main track of fashion. It was sort of non-mainstream. It was what young people wore at the time, but young people did not dictate fashion at the time. So like young people's outfits were not what you would show in Vogue. What you would show in Vogue or in like fashion magazines were dresses for people over like 30, 40, 50. So another thing, which is kind of sad and disappointing to some people, but it's also a very popular misconception, is that 1950s in terms of body image was all about those like curvy women. And I've seen that in some of the videos discussing like different body types around different eras, but actually that is completely false. If you look at the models from the magazines or photographs from the era, anyone that is considered beautiful is really skinny. And I mean, some of the models from 1950s look even skinnier, I would say, than modern models because they're like completely flat. Their waists are insanely tiny. You can have a look at the Vima, whose waist was like, I don't know how much that is in inches, but it was probably like 50 centimeters. So basically anyone that wanted to make a career in fashion would have to be really skinny. When it comes to actresses, it actually shows because none of them are plus size, to be honest. If you look at Grace Kelly, Audrey Hepburn, they're all really tiny. And I know Marilyn is supposed to be like the prime example of how curvy women were embraced at the time, but to be honest, her actual measurements were really tiny. Her waist was smaller than my waist, and if you look at her like objectively, she is not plus size at all. She just has a nice figure. If you look at her leg, there is no cellulite or anything. She has no tummy fat, and I think she just looks like regular actresses from nowadays, which means sadly that no, plus size women did not have the best time in 1950s. A different thing is that a lot of the women were malnourished from World War II, and also the food wasn't great in 1950s, so not a lot of women were actually plus size. Generally speaking, people tended to be more on the thinner side, but still, probably a lot of them existed and they would not be a model in 1950s, and that's the sad truth. If you really want to think of an era where being plumpy or like plus size or curvy was considered desirable, I would say that would be 1900s. If you look at the actresses from that era, they kind of lean on the plus size side. And you had a lot of like medicines that were supposed to make your boobs grow. They had a lot of specific medicine that was supposed to make you look curvier and basically make you gain body fat. So another thing is the skirts. So I've seen a lot of modern dresses, modern like 1950s style dresses that barely reach your knee, and the truth is in 1950s all of the dresses and skirts, especially earlier in the decade, were way below your knee. And that's something I didn't notice until I read a couple of articles about how people were actually complaining about Dior's new look in 1947 for reinforcing longer skirts after they've already ditched them. So basically in World War II, because of like the fabric restrictions and a lot of stuff, the skirts got shorter to the point where they were barely covering the knee. So then when after the war in 1947 Christian Dior came out with this idea of skirts and dresses reaching your mid-calf, people were really upset. Like, women were really raging because they didn't want to wear long dresses again. They were just kind of past that, over that. They were really comfortable in their short dresses and they were kind of like, hell no, we're not doing that again. And this is why the new look sparked a lot of outrage, because they kind of saw that as a step back in terms of fashion. But it's important to remember, because then, like, when I've read about that and I've started looking at the pictures, I've actually noticed that not a single skirt reaches right to the knee. They're all kind of way below the knee. Then the skirts started getting shorter around the end of the decade, like 58, 59, and by 1960 they were sort of like mid-knee. So another thing I've noticed that people do when they try to recreate 1950s style or silhouette is that they kind of get all of the accessories at once, like gloves, pearls, earrings, hats, sunglasses, neck scarves, whatever. It's just too much. Like, if you look at actual pictures of people from the era, they rarely wear a lot of accessories. They usually just settle on, I don't know, a hat and gloves, maybe if it's really like an elegant situation, but there weren't a lot of people around that could afford going like full elegant all the time. And I think that shows in the pictures, especially in summer pictures, where you have people just going around in like blouses and skirts and not caring at all about the accessories. It also depended heavily on the outfit. Like, if you were just wearing a simple skirt and a sweater, you'd probably not go all, woo, here's my huge hat and Vogue style glasses, because that just wouldn't match. So you basically had to adjust what you wore accessories wise to what sort of outfit you were wearing. If you were like wearing a really nice cocktail dress and like going for a night out, you probably would not wear, I don't know, a huge hat or a sweater. And another thing is fluffy petticoats. We love fluffy petticoats, and it's like a symbol of 1950s. And I love the silhouette they give, like the fluffy, puffy, Vogue style silhouette. It makes your waist look smaller, so like why the hell not? The only problem is that people back in 1950s did not wear them every day. Let's just say that. They were probably not as fashion conscious as we see them today. And I've examined a lot of pictures of people from 1950s, like street style or like family pictures. And to be honest, not a lot of people wear fluffy petticoats. My cat is trying to get in. Boy! And it's also because a lot of skirts were actually quite narrow, and a fluffy petticoat would not work under that. And a lot of coats and like outerwear was also sort of A-line, and that would look really freaking weird with a fluffy petticoat underneath because it would just ruin the silhouette. So I've noticed in a lot of cases people just chose to wear like simple plain petticoats instead, like no fluff, no organza, and basically just something to have underneath. But like a lot of skirts and dresses from the era do not feature a fluffy huge petticoat. It's a bit different when it comes to like high fashion, because if you look at the photos from magazines or like the fashion drawings from the era, the sort of a puffy silhouette is accentuated a lot, but it's not like a must-have. You know what I mean? Apart from the high fashion drawings, I really don't see that happening that often in pictures from the era, which is interesting because a lot of those petticoats survived, a lot of women wore them, but it was not as common as, let's say, Edwardian petticoats or like 1920s girdles. So another thing kind of connected to that is that I used to think that 1950s is all about like glamour, and that is because I've only seen Vogue covers, actresses photo shoots, and basically a lot of fashion related content. So obviously in those pictures women are extremely elegant and they're just stunning. Everything matches, the tailoring is impeccable, they're all wearing high heels, and they basically look like goddesses. So I remember looking at those pictures and thinking, wow, well, I could never live in 1950s because damn, I would just feel uncomfortable in clothes like that, you know? And it took me a while to actually understand that this is not at all what people were wearing at the time. Similarly to today, like if you look at a Vogue magazine, obviously like people are not wearing that style because it's like A, avant-garde, and B, it's expensive. And I didn't think about that a lot of the designs were not meant for the public, like they were not meant to be worn every day. If you have a look at like Balenciaga coats or I don't know, Charles James dresses, I always confuse him with James Charles, oh my goodness. They are not meant for like everyday wear, and you would not wear a Balenciaga dress for your prom because you're not a freaking millionaire. And I kind of didn't figure that out, that what people wore on the Vogue covers was not compatible with what people actually wore. So there's a lot more than the Vogue fashion going on in 1950s. There are the subcultures, there are the like housewives, regular people, there are more like minimalistic styles, there are pants, there are schoolgirls. There's a lot happening that is not really mentioned there because it's not like the mainstream high fashion. This is important to understand. And also I remember looking at the photos of models in the magazines and going like, their waists are insane. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I realized a huge amount of these models are actually wearing some sort of corsetry or like a really stiff girdle to help them achieve that silhouette. Don't worry, as long as you don't see a model in a two-piece suit having the same type of figure, it's probably not. Like, she's probably heavily corseted to make her look what she's supposed to look. And also don't forget that they could edit photos at that time, and so not everything you see is true. So another thing is that high heels in 1950s were not actually that high. Even the stilettos they had at the time were usually not higher than, let's say, 10 to 12 centimeters, and I think 12 is like the highest it got. The only shoes higher than that were like fetish shoes. If you look at the photos of of stars, of like Hollywood actresses, obviously the heels are quite high, but notice how a lot of those photos were taken during a photo shoot or like for a photo shoot, so they might have only worn the shoes to make their legs look better. But for like everyday looks, a lot of women chose kitten heels that were actually not that high, or like flats. A lot of people wore flats, surprisingly, especially younger women. And another thing is, Mary Janes were not really a thing in 1950s. They were considered sort of passé. They smelled like 1930s and 40s, which was obviously old-fashioned by then. So if you're going for like an authentic 1950s look, Mary Janes do not look right with the silhouette. The skirts were quite long, and the Mary Jane cut sort of made your leg look shorter. So like visually it just was not a match. The most popular shoe was sort of like just a simple ballerina style cut, if you know what I mean, like open feet. I don't know how to call it, but you know, those still like regular heels. Also, makeup. So there's this stereotype of 50s makeup being a black eyeliner, heavy brows, and a really red lipstick. It was a thing, especially if you look at the models like Davima or like Susie Parker was her name. They do sport that look a lot simply because it's quite dramatic and it works well for the fashion like photo shoot. So if you look at regular people or even stars, actresses from the era, not a lot of them decide to go with that look. A lot of women chose more subtle lipstick shades, especially that they were more developed in 1950s. A lot of pink and peach shades appeared, which was quite popular with a lot of women. Even like Marilyn Monroe, I think she loved her pink lipstick. The cherry red, let's say, it was kind of also passé at the time because it looked a lot like 1940s lipsticks. So what was more popular at the time was sort of like brighter red, orangey red shades. Eyeshadows were a huge thing in 1950s, and a lot of women would choose like really bright pastel colors such as like lilac, green, I don't know, blue, what else, yellow, you know, all of the pastel shades that you could think of, pink, and they would just paint their eyelids with that. So it's not always a black eyeliner and a red lipstick. Another thing is, and I've noticed that when I was watching this compilation on YouTube of the crown scenes compared with the actual footage of Queen Elizabeth, and I've noticed how the original Queen Elizabeth's hair is much shorter than the actresses, and I was thinking how we always tend to make 1950s hair much longer than they actually were. A lot of people cut their hair really short to the point they actually almost look like men's hair, and true, it does not fit like every face type, and it does make you look a little bit like a granny, but that was what they wore, and that's a look that's really difficult to achieve if you have longer hair. If we're talking about post 1952, a lot of women had really like tiny, almost pixie style haircuts. Even if you look at 1950s starlets, not a lot of them have longer hair. If your hair reaches your shoulders after you've set it, it probably means it's too long. And that's something that people always get wrong, even when they do like authentic 1950s hairstyles. But what people did when their hair was long, they would sort of sport something that I'm wearing today, though I do look like a teacher and I don't like that hairstyle at all, but they would basically have a really tight bun that also looked really elegant, and it would work for longer type hair. Younger women also wore ponytails, and also younger women in general were sort of allowed to have longer hair because they were, again, out of fashion. And the last thing that kind of irks me every time I see someone sporting a 1950s look is that people tend to go for polka dots and cherry patterns a lot, sort of like a typical pin-up pattern at this point. And I mean, it's cool, it's not like they did not exist, it's just I don't know where that came from because it was not the most popular pattern at all. I'd say polka dots were just as popular at the time as stripes or like thread, whereas cherries, I'm not sure where that came from. It was not at all like a huge trend. It was probably one of the novelty prints, but that was not at all the most popular pattern, and actually there isn't much, like there isn't a lot of dresses that feature that pattern. So enough of my babbling. Hopefully now you have a little wider perspective of what 1950s fashion was. I don't know, I just kind of hope this pushes you to explore 1950s because it's a really interesting decade. Let me know if there are any other misconceptions you think people have about 1950s fashion and how they're wrong. Let's diss them in the comments. That's it. I don't have anything else to say.